All right, we might make a start. Good morning to you all, and thank you for coming along to support our summer scholars this year. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the traditional country of the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of Canberra, where we're meeting. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. My name is Tom Rogers, and I'm a historian in the military history section here at the Australian War Memorial. I carry out research on frontier conflict, overseas colonial contingents, the Boer War, and the First World War. Now, since 1985, the military history section of the Australian War Memorial has hosted 98 young, promising historians under the Summer Scholars scheme, providing them with practical experience of working in a major historical institution. Each scholar, when they come here, is paired up with an academic supervisor from the military history section. I'd like to thank, in addition to my colleagues in military history, I'd like to thank Eric Carpenter from the Research Centre and the other staff of the Research Centre who have helped our scholars in their journey through the archives, the travel officers and finance representatives, Kira Hopkinson and Christy Kosh, Anne Benny, the Assistant Director, and the Director, Dr. Brendan Nelson, for their continued support for our program. The key difference, I think, between our Summer Scholars program and some of the other similar programs around Canberra is that when our scholars arrive, we actually give them their topic. So they don't bring a project with them, and they don't choose their own topic. So that means that what you're seeing this morning is the result of 6 weeks of intensive research here at the Australian War Memorial. And I think you'll agree with me that the results are very impressive indeed. So this morning, I'll ask each academic supervisor to come up and introduce their scholar. Then the scholar will speak for 20 minutes. We'll then have 10 minutes for questions and answers from the scholar. And I just ask you, when you do ask a question, if you wait for the microphone to come to you so that we can all hear. Thank you. All right then, without any further ado, let's get into it. Our first speaker this morning is Alexandra McKinnon, and I was her supervisor. So Alex joins us from the Australian National University, where she's currently completing a Masters of Philosophy. She also works here at the Memorial in Education. She completed a Bachelor of Arts with honours at the University of Toronto in History and Material Culture. So I'd like to ask Alex to come up. She's going to speak on the topic of impressions of empire. Can we all make her very welcome? Thank you.
Fancy meeting you in Egypt at the Sphinx. It's a long way to Tipperary, wrote Lance Sergeant Ian Gordon McInnes on January 27, 1915. This message was left in Sister Nellie Constance Maurice's autograph book. While the relationship between the two is otherwise unclear, they presumably knew one another from Sydney. McInnes would die shortly thereafter, last seen on the far side of Lone Pine on April 25, 1915. Aside from this portrait of McInnes, taken in civilian clothes before he left Australia for the last time, this is all we have. He wasn't at the front long enough to write home. In the Memorial's collection, autograph books hold dozens of inscriptions, signatures, messages, poems, and drawings, all left by men and women determined to leave their mark. The inscriptions in the pages of these books provide a means of understanding the intricacies of empire in the early 20th century, moving beyond the relationship between Australia and Britain, and centering instead on the lived experiences of those who served. This presentation will explore Australian attitudes towards Britain and the British Empire between 1899 and 1919, focusing on autograph books as a previously unconsidered historical source. This does not purport to be a definitive study. I'm looking at autograph books owned by 10 Australian women who served as nurses across the battlefields of the Boer War and the First World War. The inscriptions within these autograph books demonstrate a continuity between 1899 and 1919, a common language written in literary quotations and repeated ideals. These autograph books provide a means of exploring portrayals of life at the front, attitudes towards Britain, and perceptions of the broader British Empire. My focus is on the images and inscriptions within the pages of these books, but this presentation will also draw from the broader collection of records held by the memorial. This is an opportunity to bring this material culture into the historical record. I wanted to begin with George Lambert. His painting, Anzac the Landing 1915, with Australian troops ascending the steep hillside of Gallipoli, is one of the iconic images of the First World War. During the war, Lambert corresponded with staff nurse Charlotte Elizabeth Evans, and he left a sketch in her autograph book towards the end of the war. This is a self-portrait of Lambert and his horse, captioned, "The Love That Never Dies," an image at odds with his public art. Autograph books are both personal and national history, neither private diary nor intended for public consumption. Instead, they fit somewhere in between. Between the Boer War and the First World War, change is most evident in depictions of life at the front. There are no images of battlefields in either Sister Agnes Cox or then Sister Bessie Pocock's autograph books. In Agnes Cox's autograph book, this is the only image of a Boer soldier, captioned "A Son of the Veld." In the same book, the sketch of a New Zealander soldier is also included, and the captions could be swapped with little distinction. As Banjo Patterson wrote in 1899, "We think of the Boer as semi-savages, but we have plenty of people just as rough as they are." Indeed, as he wrote while describing a Boer homestead, everything reminds one of Australia. With the First World War, an imperial sense of solidarity is emphasized, while portrayals of the enemy become far less sympathetic. Germany becomes the subject of both ridicule and hatred, with representations of both the German Kaiser and German soldiers. Please note the label on this cartoon, the gas bag. This is the only representation of Turkish soldiers, and seems as much a commentary on the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, as on the men themselves. With the First World War, the battlefield comes into focus. Images of life at the front are repeated, contrasted with safety behind the lines and distant homes. Caricatures of the trenches appear from the Gallipoli campaign onwards, while references to shell shock become increasingly common. Soldiers explain why they are fighting, perhaps distinguishing themselves from those who would not or could not go. A quote from Perseus in Charles Kingsley's The Heroes is a popular choice in both conflicts. "'Tis better to die like a hero than live like an ox in his stall." As the First World War progressed, other inscriptions acknowledged the devastation of the fighting, attributing a spiritual element to their service. In April 1918, in the middle of the German Spring Offensive, an Australian gunner wrote, "They say, could there be such a hideous blot as war, with God above? But we who know him trust him through it all. Nothing our faith shall move." The shelter of the hospital becomes inextricably linked to the horrors that both precede and succeed its warmth. Matron Margaret Ann Gray annotated inscriptions in her autograph book with newspaper clippings or a pencil date of death regarding the fate of those who returned to the front lines, an abrupt conclusion to the brief inscriptions. And in these inscriptions, imagery of conflict is contrasted with the owners of these autograph books. Nurses negotiated the space between the home front and the battlefield, occupying a space of, but not in, the armed forces. The professional capacity of nurses is eclipsed by their presence as a reminder of home, part angel, part maternal figure, part romantic ideal. This is a constant over this time period. The same quote from Walter Scott is used to describe various nurses at least 5 times between 1901 and 1919. "O woman, in our hours of ease, uncertain, coy, and hard to please. When pain and anguish wring the brow, a ministering angel thou." Of course, the inscriptions are on occasion more personal, testifying to individual service and devotion. Recovering in hospital in Rouen, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Moss Blundell wrote for Margaret Gray, "The DSO is every day fully earned by Sister Gray." And he actually supplemented this with a piece of ribbon from his own DSO, earned in the fighting along the Somme in 1916. And with the First World War, many Australian soldiers draw a distinction between being nursed by British nurses and VADs, voluntary detachment members, and being nursed by Australians. The nurses are drawn as a reflection of, as one poet writes, "the Bonza girls with Boscar eyes left at home in Australia." In 1919, on the return home to Australia, Tom Steeple of the 12th Australian Light Horse Regiment wrote, "What makes us proud to be Australians? Our girls, our army, and our country's freedom." Many of these inscriptions are quotations from elsewhere, and these phrases repeat. This is a common language that is unfamiliar to us now, using popular images and phrases as substitutes for their own. And while these may not be their own words, these inscriptions have been chosen by their writers as their best reflections of themselves. These quotations are repeated. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam and an assortment of Shakespearean references appear frequently, if occasionally misquoted. Other references are less familiar to us now. We tend to associate the First World War with the poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, but writers in these autograph books tend to use much of the same patriotic literature that their forebears did in 1899. Perhaps what is often dismissed as popular poetry. Perhaps the best known representative of imperial ideals, Rudyard Kipling is a constant presence. The absent-minded beggar served as a call for support during the Boer War, while his work is repeated throughout this time period. American Ella Wheeler Wilcox, British-Canadian Robert Service, and Australian Adam Lindsay Gordon are also popular choices. References to the royal family reflect these imperial aspirations and contemplate Australia's position within the empire. In her diary, Bessie Pocock recorded in detail attending the coronation of Edward VII and Queen Alexandra in 1902. In 1919, staff nurse Isaline Jeanette Cowley recorded the signature of the Prince of Wales in her autograph book. In this case, the context is a bit different. She had the Prince of Wales sign on the same page as two names with Australian associations: General William Birdwood, the British commander of Anzac Corps, and Sir Harry Chevelle, the Australian-born commander of the Desert Mounted Corps, both veterans of the Boer War. And for Isaline Cowley, these men were members of the same imperial elite. She interspersed inscriptions in her autograph book with pasted images from newspapers, keeping track of Australian Victoria Cross winners like Neville House and Percy Storkey, whose signature you can actually see next to his image. With that, there are some challenges with this research. Writers do not always identify their name or rank, and signatures are not always legible. This is not being written for posterity. And that makes it difficult to quantify difference between officers and other ranks. One exception is in the use of Greek and Latin phrases. All of these writers identify themselves as officers. These inscriptions may be a product of their upbringing or a deliberate attempt to signify social status. In this case, he has also listed his university. Across every level of the military, though, inscriptions repeat common images and phrases. Beyond a shared literary language, there are also repeated visual references. This image of a soldier and nurse appears across several autograph books. And references are edited or paraphrased as necessary. In this copy of the Trench song, Sing Me to Sleep Where Bullets Fall, itself a parody of a popular 1902 song that began, Sing Me to Sleep, the Shadows Fall, references to Ypres have been replaced by Lone Pine. Far from Lone Pine I'd like to be, where Turkish snipers cannot pot me. Think of me crouching where graybacks creep, waiting for something to put me to sleep. The song, My Little Grey Home in the West, popularized by Australian Peter Dawson in 1911, captions this 1918 illustration by Private Horace Leslie Nines from Blythe, South Australia. The original lyrics are transformed by an Australian soldier with the 28th Battalion in Staff Nurse Gertrude May Skyring's autograph book into My Little Wet Home in the Trench, that the rainstorms continually drench. In Margaret Gray's autograph book, a British soldier with the Suffolk Regiment also notes, there's a dead cow close by, but they're hoofed towards the sky, and she gives off a beautiful stench. In the same autograph book, this has been edited in another way by a member of the Lancashire Fusiliers. There's a hospital down in Rouen. Get there if you can. It's très bon. These complaints about conditions and the trenches and the enemy and shell shock sit alongside platitudes with no apparent contradiction. These autograph books are part yearbook, part confessional. Although conscious of a distinction between Australia and Britain, most imperial soldiers acknowledge a shared white heritage. This drawing by Gunner Frederick Baxter of the 2nd Australian Field Artillery Brigade illustrates this point. A chip off the old block sees a young lion labeled Australia having caught a fox labeled Emden. Its parent watches approvingly, the reference to Britain requiring no label. More than a decade earlier, in the poem With French to Kimberley, Banjo Patterson had written, "They're met beneath the worldwide flag, the worldwide empire's sons. They came to prove to all the earth that kinship conquers space, and those who fight the British Isles must fight the British race. There is, however, a change between the Boer War and the First World War. Open criticism of political leadership is included alongside other quotations, such as this image of a pig in uniform labeled GHQ, Grand Hindquarters. In Bessie Pocock's autograph book, there is also this poem regarding British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Lloyd George, no doubt, when his life ebbs out, will ride in a flaming chariot and sit in state on a red-hot plate between Satan and Judas Iscariot. It goes on. This may not represent the views of the majority, but it has still been written and included and shared. Many of the inscriptions are more reflective. In 1919, on the return to Australia, Frederick Augustus Spencer, a chaplain with the 7th Light Horse Regiment, wrote, "Which would you rather be, my old war mate or me?" His writing emphasized that the dead will not grow old, while the living must labor yet, doubt yet, grieve yet, become ill yet, die yet. Some censorship does occur, as seen with this page from Isleen Cowley's autograph book, where an image entitled "On the Day on Which Peace is Declared" has been obscured by a field postcard from a prisoner of war in a work camp in Germany. But this is unusual. These autograph books demonstrate interaction and engagement with men and women from across the British Empire, even as simply as through this thank you note from a Canadian captain with the Canadian Expeditionary Force. From Canada to Australia, with kindest thoughts. Many of the illustrations are comparative. While acknowledging a shared military heritage, many suggest an inherent difference between colonial and British forces and between Australia and Britain. Most of these comparisons are friendly, such as this image from a convalescent home for Australian officers drawn shortly before Christmas 1917. Distinctions between the fighting over here and life back home seem to refer as much to Britain as to Australia. Other imperial soldiers often portray themselves as caricatures, such as this drawing by a Scottish soldier of the Queen's Own Royal Glasgow Yeomanry, encouraging the viewer to keep up your spirits. And the corners of the British Empire are portrayed as a cohesive fighting force, such as through this toast to British and colonial regiments. Here's luck to the NZs and Aussies, and the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, the Cameronian regiment that fought at Armentières. Side by side, they fought and died while shrapnel fell like hell. Here's luck to the Scottish Rifles and their stunt at Neuve-Chapelle. Indian soldiers are notably absent from this reference to the stunt at Neuve-Chapelle, although the Indian Army was a substantial part of the 1915 battle and suffered a third of the Allied casualties. For the most part, non-white troops and civilian populations are excluded from these autograph books and absent from references to a British identity. Beyond the empire itself, Egyptian civilians only appear in caricature form, with one inscription suggesting that God forgot to make the little Egyptians white. Another image gives the principal import of Egypt as Australian troops. There's also this cartoon regarding cricket. Are these Australians good fighters? By Allah, I should say so. Some years ago, 11 of them beat all England. Australian nurses were barred from nursing Indian soldiers, which might account for part of this disparity, but there is still clearly interaction happening. Bessie Pocock wrote approvingly in her diary of an Indian lecture at the YMCA just behind the lines in France, and visited a hospital for Indian soldiers in Egypt. This inscription has been left by a white officer serving with the Indian Army just a few months after the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle. The majority of these inscriptions are far less detailed than these images, however, and I want to return to the signatures. Approximately half of the inscriptions in these autograph books are only signatures, sometimes of particular events, all the members of a particular regiment at a particular hospital on a particular day, for instance, or attendees for Christmas dinner 1917. These inscriptions are still a valuable resource, demonstrating interaction and engagement across the breadth of these conflicts. This is the first page of Gertrude Skyring's autograph book, and shows an Australian nurse serving alongside Australian, British, and Canadian nurses and VADs at a hospital in Rouen. In the center of this page, you can see Marion Elizabeth Lean Smith, who gives her address as the Home Farm, Fredericton Junction, Sunbury County, New Brunswick. Marion Smith's background reflects the complexities of empire. While she enlisted from Canada, she is the only known Australian Aboriginal woman to have served in the First World War. Marion Smith was a Darug woman, born in Liverpool, New South Wales, and had immigrated to Canada as a child. Just like Ian McInnes, she has no other written record at the memorial, Still, we know she was there. She tells us that herself with this signature. Artifacts from the broader collection illustrate these complexities and connections. This is an Indian rupee coin from 1840, modified into a sweetheart brooch by a British soldier serving in India. He then served in South Africa during the Boer War and subsequently immigrated to Australia, hence its inclusion in our collection. Across this time period, inscriptions appear in Welsh and Gaelic, but also in French, from French and French-Canadian soldiers, Swahili, from white South African soldiers, and attempts at Arabic. This Rhodesian soldier is mapped as home on an illustration of the African continent. Kia ora, the Maori language greeting, appears at least once in each autograph book and is used equally by Australian and New Zealander soldiers. On the left, you might recognize kamate, the haka popularized through its use by the All Blacks. So what can this research tell us? This research tells us that men struggling to describe an Australian nurse in 1919 and 1901 used the same verse. It tells us that Australians, or at least a proportion of the Australians represented in these autograph books, decided that Robert Service, the British-Canadian poet known as the Bard of the Yukon, could speak for them. I contend that there's not a fundamental difference in what the majority of these men and women are writing in 1899 and 1919. Shifting attitudes on a societal level move far more slowly than we tend to assume, and the broader British Empire remains in focus across these autograph books. What you do see, however, is a reframing of the boundaries. When an inscription in an autograph book in 1917 details the moment of impact of an attack in a way you do not see in written accounts from the Boer War, remembrance of that thunderclap which threw your mangled body on the wire, that is not to suggest that this was representative of all who wrote. What it does suggest, however, is that this was within the realm of social acceptability in a way it was not in 1899. This writing may not reflect the majority opinion, but it is still being written and allowed to remain. In these autograph books, these signatures reflect a process of interaction and engagement across the boundaries of the British Empire and throughout this time period. Each signature is a reminder. I was here, I was a part of this, and I want you to remember me. Thank you. Yes, of course.
Thank you very much for that, Alex. That was very interesting. Do we have questions for Alex? Raise your hand and a microphone will make its way to you.
Congratulations, Alex, on a bonza paper, and congratulations to the Memorial for commissioning such an exciting excursion into cultural history. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about how these records enter the Memorial. As you say, they're not written for posterity, but they become part of posterity when they enter the Memorial's collection. Did they enter the collection in the 1920s when there was that earnest commissioning of sources, or were they in fact given to the Memorial by families after these women had died? Because that will tell us something, won't it, about the personal investment in these remarkable sources.
Yeah. Thank you, Bruce. That's a fantastic question. So these autograph books wind up in the Memorial through a variety of ways, and it's actually a testament to how much they haven't been considered as a collective, in the sense that you can find them in, I think, 3 different sections of the Record Center. The most recent autograph books to wind up in the collection were donated in 2012, along with other diaries from Bessie Pocock. They were donated by her great niece, who also helpfully transcribed the diaries as well. Others appear in the Memorial through a variety of ways. It doesn't appear as if people ever deliberately set out to collect autograph books. They just appear with other collections. For the most part, they're donated alongside other artifacts. It seems as if the earliest ones do arrive in the 1920s.
Thank you for a fabulous talk. I'm just wondering whether, my understanding in World War I, say, taking the Western Front as a case in point, that there was censorship of letters, say, from Australian soldiers back to Australia to their friends and family. With these autograph books, I assume that because they probably weren't sent through the mail, that there's no censorship, and therefore there's at least the prospect of perhaps more criticism than might survive a letter. And I'm just wondering if you found much of that. I mean, I know you touched on some of that, but I'm just interested if if you found things that maybe wouldn't have survived censorship.
Thank you for the question. As you can imagine, there's quite a range of inscriptions in these books, and as you can imagine, something like that poem by Lloyd George would probably not pass through censorship. What you do see, though, is self-censorship. The case of that postcard being placed over, there are a few cases where I found inscriptions which have been scribbled out, and of course we can only speculate about what those reasons might be. But of course these aren't private diaries either. They're not writing their innermost thoughts. They're writing it's not only being written from someone, but it's being written to someone as well. So they're writing what they think somebody else might want to see. Okay. I'm sorry, I don't know if that answered the question. I'm going to assume I did a really wonderful job. We've all just been stunned into silence.
Thank you very much for that,
final
Alex.
question? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting presentation. I'd like to call Dr. Carl James to come up and introduce his scholar, Hannah Viney. Thanks, Carl.
Cheers, thank you, Tom, and congratulations, Alex. That was a fantastic paper. Good morning, everyone. My name is Carl James, and I'm a historian here at the Australian War Memorial. And for the last 6 weeks, it's really been my pleasure to supervise Hannah Viney. Now, as Tom mentioned, the difference between the Memorial Summer Scholar Program and others conducted, say, at the Parliamentary Library or the National Archives or the National Library, is that when scholars come here, we give them the topic. So Hannah joined us from Monash University. Her honours thesis was looking at the representations of the Cold War in the Australian Women's Weekly in the 1950s, and her PhD thesis is looking at the role of women's activism, so women in the anti-nuclear movement between 1945 and 1991. So of course, we give Hannah the topic of looking at the contribution of the Royal Australian Navy in the Mediterranean during the Second World War. Now, in many ways, Hannah was the model summer scholar. She did her readings before she arrived. She took the very broad topic of looking at the role of the RAN from 1940 to 43 in the Mediterranean. She looked at the sources, she came up with her own topic, defined it and concentrated it by looking at the role of the RAN during the evacuation from Greece in 1941. She also listened to comments and feedback from her supervisor as well as her peers in the military history section, and on occasion she just did as she was told. So with that, I'll welcome Hannah to the stage.
Good morning, thank you for coming. How do I change? So, at 10 p.m. on the 25th of April, 1941, the destroyers HMAS Waterhen and Vendetta approached Megara Beach in southern Greece. There they joined the troop ships SS Thurland Castle, the light cruiser HMS Coventry, and the destroyers HMS Rheineck, who were waiting to embark the 5,000 British and Commonwealth troops assembled. Under a new moon, the complete darkness of the night was interrupted periodically by flashes of light, as troops destroyed equipment to prevent German forces utilising it after the evacuation. Though hoping to embark 600 troops, Waterhen managed only around 70, while Vendetta embarked 350. The convoy left Megara before dawn. First-class stoker Andrew Nation from Waterhen wrote in his diary that the German aircraft bombed the hell out of us all the way to Crete. But the ships arrived safely at Suda Bay at 6 p.m. on the 26th. Waterhen and Vendetta's Anzac Day journey marked the 26th anniversary since the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, better known as Anzacs, landed on Gallipoli on April 25th, 1915. In April 1941, the 6th Australian Division and the New Zealand Division were grouped together under the command of Anzac Corps, briefly reviving the famous formation. Many Australians were conscious of the significance of when the evacuations were taking place and marked Anzac Day next to the date in their diaries. Australian newspapers in the years following presented the evacuation campaign as that other Anzac Day, comparing the Australian forces in Greece to the Greek heroes of thousands of years ago. The age in 1947 evoked the qualities that have come to define the Anzacs in popular memory: courage, endurance, and resourcefulness. In a letter home in January 1941, Chief Petty Officer in HMAS Perth, Don Viney, wrote of how the Australians certainly make history when they get going. Hearing stories of soldiers and ships' actions, Don wrote, makes one glow with a warmth of pride to belong to the land of the Southern Cross. Don Viney would be killed in action when Perth sank in 1942, remembered by those who survived as the hero of the Perth. Such sentiments, expressed in newspapers and personal correspondence, exemplify how Australians since 1915 have seen the Anzacs as brave, valiant men, willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Recent efforts to tell the story of the Royal Australian Navy's involvement in the evacuations can inadvertently lead readers to view the Australian naval presence as a distinctly Australian story. Over the course of the evacuation from Greece, the light cruiser HMAS Perth, alongside the First World War scrap iron flotilla destroyers HMAS Stuart, Vampire, Vendetta, Voyager and Waterhen, participated in embarking troops from around the Greek coast. Perth and Stuart would later be joined by the destroyers HMAS Napier and Nizam to aid in the evacuation of British and Commonwealth forces from Crete. Yet the RAN ships involved in the evacuations formed just one part of a larger Royal Navy presence in the Mediterranean. Of the 47 ships involved in Operation Demon to evacuate Greece, 6 were RAN ships. In the Crete evacuations, 4 out of 25 ships were Australian. Using memoirs such as those of Chief Petty Officer Richard W. Stanton, who recalled how Australian soldiers cheered wildly when the crew hoisted the Australian flag to the masthead to let the troops know that it was an Aussie ship which had escorted them home, it would be easy to cast RAN contributions to the evacuations as iconically Australian. This overplays, however, the important but parallel role the Australian Navy performed in the operations. To step back a minute, why was the evacuation of Greece, which will be the focus of today, necessary? The Mediterranean Sea represented a strategic opportunity for both the British and the Italians in 1940 to 1941. Control of the Mediterranean would offer an advantage to either side in the war. The British focused on supporting their bases in Malta and Alexandria, as well as their land campaigns in North Africa and the Middle East, by ensuring they had a safe passage through the Red Sea and Suez Canal to the eastern Mediterranean. The Italians, aiming to seize territory in mainland Greece and Crete, hoped to cut the British off from their base in Malta by mining the passage between Sicily and North Africa, effectively preventing the fleet from interfering in invasion plans. The Italians invaded Greece in October 1940, and it appeared that Germany would join them. In early 1941, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the Chiefs of Staff in London decided to send British and Commonwealth forces to aid the Greek resistance. From March, the Navy transported troops from Egypt to Greece in Operation Lustre. Throughout the operation, German and Italian attacks on naval convoys intensified, coming to a head on the 28th of March in the Battle of Cape Matapan. After a day of British pursuit of the Italians and a heated exchange of fire from 10:30 p.m. until just after 11, the British sank 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers from the Italian fleet. This victory would later prove to be a blessing during the evacuations, neutralising the threat of the Italian surface forces. By the beginning of April, the German forces did invade Greece and Yugoslavia, and 62,532 British, Australian and New Zealand troops were on the mainland. Succumbing to the overwhelming German forces in mid-April, the British made the decision to evacuate on the 21st. The evacuations were technical and challenging, and required both cooperation and communication between the different services. From Suda Bay in Crete, Vice Admiral Henry Pridham Whipple, commander of the 1st Battle Squadron in the Mediterranean, was in charge of the evacuations. Rear Admiral H.T. Bailey Groman from Middle East Command was sent to liaise with General Sir Henry Maitland Wilson, leader of the British forces in Greece. Their communication relied on landline transmitters, which ultimately created difficulties as they were vulnerable to disruption, unreliable and unwieldy. Once the evacuation was decided upon, Bailey Groman had little time to undertake a thorough naval reconnaissance, meaning locations and resources for evacuation were limited. Though evacuations would ideally have been conducted at established docks, many had to make use of natural bays and beaches to avoid German forces, particularly once the main port in Athens, the Piraeus, was wrecked. From the beaches, docks and piers outwards, the Navy was in charge of the evacuations. The senior naval officer afloat held the highest command of the naval officers involved. In theory, being able to monitor the situation, the officer afloat was placed to direct troops to the beaches where they were needed. In practice, though this worked, the constantly changing conditions made it difficult for the officer afloat to be aware of the needs of every evacuation point. In future, the Commanders-in-Chief recommended that the senior British naval officer on the shore should have greater command of ships within 40 or 50 miles of the beaches, as he was more ideally placed to see the situation as it unfolded and thus allocate ships most effectively. Under the officer afloat and senior naval officer on land, each evacuation beach was commanded by naval officers designated the beachmasters. These were assisted at each site by military officers and would determine how the evacuation at each location would proceed based on the unique conditions of each beach and evacuating party. The beachmasters would then pass the evacuation orders on to the military landing officers, who would in turn direct troops to the beaches and onto the boats or ships. As each evacuation party moved into position on the beaches and into the boats each night, a covering force would remain behind to protect against enemy attacks. In Greece, there were 16 different evacuating parties that needed to withdraw to 6 collecting areas before being embarked from 10 beaches. Key personnel, such as army officers, were given first priority for evacuation. Other available troops would embark next, followed by the covering force, only once all other personnel had been evacuated. This resulted in greater difficulties, however, as the early removal of experienced senior personnel made controlling the troops and enforcing evacuation orders difficult, concluding that the organisation for handling personnel must be simple, fully understood by all, and rigorously applied. The Commanders-in-Chief determined that the order of evacuations should be drawn up with great care. The evacuation proceeded over 5 nights, between 24th and 29th of April, with troops gathering at the collecting areas from the 22nd. At Navplion, around 9,800 troops, staff and civilians gathered to evacuate from S and T beaches. At Theodore, approximately 13,000 gathered to embark from J Beach. Around 5,200 gathered at Megara to evacuate from P Beach, and roughly 9,000 troops assembled at Porto Rufty and Rafina to evacuate from C and D beaches. On the 23rd of April, German aircraft destroyed the remaining Royal Air Force planes at the Argos airfield, leaving the evacuation without air protection. Prior to this, the Navy was already troubled by German air dominance, and with the loss of British air support, the prospect of increased interference from German air raids initiated a change in evacuation plans. In the revised plans, the more vulnerable beaches at Attica would be used sparingly, and beaches further south in the Peloponnese would be added to the evacuation zones. Beach Z at Kalamata was added, where at least 8,000 troops from the 16th and 17th Australian Brigades were to embark. At Monemvasia, Pleitra and Githian, beaches X, N and Y were included to take the New Zealand Division and any other stragglers. Beach J was abandoned and Navlipon was set up as the evacuation headquarters. The situation in the water and on the beaches was chaotic. Leading signalman Mick D. Little remembered the scene that greeted Vampire as it approached Navplion on the 23rd. With troop ship MV Ulster Prince going aground twice, several ships on fire, fires ashore, and the smell of burning oil. To get the troops onto the ships, any available vessel was utilised. Landing craft from ships, flat-bottom barges, whalers and skiffs were used alongside local vessels such as cakes to ferry evacuating forces from the beach. Petty Officer William Bracht in the light cruiser Perth later remembered picking up troops on the night of the 24th, recalling that as soon as we flashed the signal to shore, scores of small boats came towards us. Soon we had hundreds of soldiers clambering up the nets onto the ship. Once on the ships, the chaos continued. With the loss of air support and the increased precarity of the evacuations, the Navy decided to make maximum use of destroyers in embarking troops. Not designed for troop transport, the destroyers soon became overrun with exhausted troops in search of a place to sleep, food, or even a cup of tea. Bracht recalled walking onto the mess deck to see soldiers everywhere, some sleeping and others talking, all of them looking just about done, according to D. Little. Though the use of destroyers as troop transports rather than screens against enemy attack made the operation more precarious, this was not necessarily a weakness of the evacuation. Stuart, under Captain Hector Heck Waller, was instrumental in evacuating a greater number of troops from Tolos and Napoleon than expected on the night of the 26th. Arriving at Tolos just after 11 p.m, the destroyer found 600 troops waiting for embarkation on a lighter barge, and a large number of soldiers waiting on shore. Embarking the troops from the barge, Waller requested assistance of a cruiser from Napoleon, where both Perth and HMS Orion were involved in evacuations. While awaiting the arrival of Perth, Waller in Stuart transported the 600 on board to Napoleon and offloaded them to Orion before returning to embark more troops. Through Waller's assessment of the situation, a total of 1,620 troops were evacuated from Tolos that night. The operation was perilous and in constant threat from German bombers and Italian submarines. The evacuations had to proceed without the support of the battle fleet, and convoys were vulnerable without this protection. Able seaman James Duncan Cooper, writing in his diary in Perth, recorded the hazards of the journey from Greece to Crete. "We are looking forward to a very hot time of it, for if the Germans get a wake up to us, we are in for trouble. We had about 6 air raids read till about dinner time, and then without anyone seeing them, 2 dive bombers came out of the sun and let go 4 bombs at the troop ships, but missed, thank God. We have fighters up all around us, but they never seen them." The constant possibility of bomb attacks added emotional strain to the evacuations for the ship's companies, as they always had to be ready for trouble. Cooper wrote of the nervous tension and exhaustion he was under throughout the evacuation, when everyone is on their toes. "I was very nervous, and often thought we would get a dish into us any minute. God, what a night." Similarly, First Class Stoker Nation wrote of his terror during an air raid. Nation was sitting on deck when one bloke pointed up in the sky and said, "Here they come." When I looked, all I could see was this thin line coming down vertically. I scrambled under cover and heard a bomb whistling down. That's the time you really give yourself up, when you hear them whistling. He only dropped 2 bombs, and by the size of the explosion, I think that was all he could carry. We can't get missed much longer. It's on the wall that we will collect a packet. The first one hit the water 25 yards forehand, and the second one about the distance from our stern. The ship shook and shuddered all over, and shrapnel clattered against the side like hailstones. Several chaps got hit with small pieces, but none serious. Several Royal Navy ships were sunk or damaged over the course of the evacuation, though no RAN ships were seriously harmed. Matters were further complicated by the poor communication, both between ships and between land and sea, caused by the unreliable wireless technology. This resulted in errors and delays that further confused the operation. On the night of the 28th of April, Perth sailed towards Kalamata to help evacuate the 8,000 troops assembled. The destroyer HMS Hero, which was sent in ahead of the other ships to gauge the situation, reported to Royal Navy officer Sir Philip Bower Smythe, captain of Perth, that the enemy had control of Kalamata. Though German forces had attacked at 6 p.m, they were driven back by Australian and New Zealand troops, who were able to regain the quay. Evacuation was possible, and troops had gathered on the southern beach. Though this information was sent to Bower Smythe, it was not received until later, and he had already made the decision to withdraw, to prevent the possibility of losing the ships under his command. Assembled forces, including the 2nd 7th Australian Infantry Battalion, signalled to the destroyers, but their signals were not recognised and the ships withdrew. Around 7,500 troops and civilians were left behind, despite attempts by HMS Hero, Kandahar, Kingston and Kimberley to evacuate without Perth. As Perth left the bay, Cooper prayed, "God help them all." The destroyers were only able to evacuate 332 before sailing at 2:30 a.m. The 2nd 7th was not among them, and the battalion surrendered to the Germans at 3:45. Though HMS Isis, Hero and Kimberley returned on the night of the 29th and the 30th, they were only able to embark small parties of stragglers, as the main forces had already capitulated and taken as prisoners of war. This was the final night of evacuations. Reports vary on how many troops were evacuated, but Admiral Sir Cunningham put the number at around 50,627 embarked from Greece. 500 were lost when SS Slamat, HMS Rheineck and Diamond sank on the 27th. Around 15,740 were left on Greece. Of those evacuated, only around 20% were embarked from established ports, the rest from beaches. the Navy had managed to embark nearly 80% of the Commonwealth forces on the mainland in confusing, complicated, and chaotic circumstances. In the days following, as the final evacuated troops were transported to Suda Bay or Alexandria, the stress of the evacuations continued. It was not until the ship's companies arrived in Alexandria and got drunk that some of the tension eased. 3 merchant ships and 2 destroyers were lost in the operation. A month later, 31 of the ships involved in the Greece evacuation were involved in the evacuations from Crete. This second evacuation, which will be discussed in more detail in my later written report, was far less effective, and there was little time for any lessons learned in Greece to be applied. Troops and ships companies were exhausted from going through an evacuation the month before. Combined with hasty evacuation plans and the overwhelming success of the German forces on Crete, this ensured that the evacuation was disjointed and disorganised. Only around 14,967 out of 28,614 troops, 50% of the forces on the island, were evacuated. The rest were left to escape or become prisoners of war. Sometime after the evacuations, signalman and amateur poet Leslie Edward Clifford from Stewart wrote, "To undertake a different job, we called at Nauplia Bay, and took our gallant lads on board, they'll fight another day." This poem, like the Age article and recollection of Chief Petty Officer Stanton, evoke an image of Anzac bravery and heroism, of Aussies helping Aussies in the spirit of mateship. Yet there were very few distinctive RAN actions in the evacuations of Greece or Crete. The most significant contributions came from Perth's ill-fated withdrawal on the 29th, which was ultimately the decision of a Royal Navy officer, not an RAN officer, and Waller's actions in Stewart on the night of the 26th. There was no way of knowing, when the destroyer raced into Nauplia Bay, whether it would be gallant Australian lads they would embark, or whether it would be Brits or Kiwis. Though Perth, Stewart, and the other RAN contributions may have been Australian ships, they had non-RAN personnel in their company, as Bower Smythe's presence illustrates. Further, the different naval origins of the company would have been indistinguishable in the eyes of the evacuated troops. RAN personnel did not wear Australian flashes on their uniform and would have been wearing anti-flash gear, including steel helmets without their identifying tallies. The Australian naval presence in the evacuations of Greece and Crete was no doubt important, in the same way that the contributions of all the ships and ships companies were important, but largely unremarkable. The RAN was just one small part of a vast operation. It may have been an Aussie ship which escorted them home, but it could easily have been a Royal Navy or merchant ship. And Private William Lancaster Carter would still have written in his diary when he embarked Greece on Anzac Day in 1941, "Thank God the Navy has taken over at last." Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Hannah. Very informative. Do we have questions for Hannah? We've got microphones on either side.
Thank you, Hannah, for that remarkable overview of such an intricate operation. Something you didn't touch on, and I wonder if you'd like to, is the complexities of the medical evacuation. I'm wondering where the wounded were prioritised on those lists of leaving the beaches. And of course, there must have been increasing numbers of wounded as those troops became more and more vulnerable to air attack.
In the Crete evacuations, wounded were given first priority to be taken onto the ships. But in the Greece evacuations, they sort of hadn't considered the possibility to the same extent. So a lot of wounded were left in the hospitals that were on the mainland and were later taken as prisoners of war. Those who were able to withtake the journey, so walking wounded who could actually still walk and would survive, the trip from wherever they were to the evacuation beach, were able to evacuate, but they weren't given a certain priority in the Greece evacuations, and obviously they realised that that was something that probably needed to be officially set down, so they later in Crete they did that, yeah.
Thank you very much. It's riveting. The thought occurred to me that one of the things that the British and even the United States had to learn was how to do opposed amphibious landings. I was wondering whether any of this learning, although it seems sort of counterintuitive, but some of this learning might have been later applied to things like prioritising getting wounded off, say at D-Day.
Very good question. As Carl said at the start, this is a topic that is very new to me. So I know that there was lessons going around at various points, but getting troops onto land from a ship is a very different operation from getting troops off the beach onto the ship. And so I think in terms of the D-Day landings, I don't know whether they would have had any, lessons that they learned from evacuations. Dunkirk was mentioned a few times in the evacuation sort of recollections from officers going, this is a second Dunkirk. So, there's a possibility that lessons, learnt in Dunkirk were applied in Greece. But because it's a very different operation going different ways, so I don't know how D-Day necessarily would have been informed by these operations. Does that answer your question?
Thanks, Anna, for that terrific presentation, and you've clarified what is a very chaotic and complex operation. And from my understanding, characterised the way in which the Australian ships were kind of interwoven with the Royal Navy. And I think it was only in the early 70s that the Royal Australian Navy stopped wearing the Royal Navy ensign. So in many ways, it was for a long time a kind of it saw its home as the Royal Navy. Did the Australian ships operate as kind of Australian task groups, or was it an accident if they operated together?
It was completely an accident if they operated together. So there was the 10th Destroyer Flotilla, which was under Captain Waller's command. And so that was where the scrap iron flotillas from the First World War sort of grouped together. But there was other ships there as well. And so in the evacuations, any time that there was multiple Australian ships, it was not a planned thing. It was just that those were the ships that had been allocated because they were the, most suitable for that evacuation, and they just happened to be Australian ships together.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Mick. Hannah, congratulations, wonderful piece of work. How much of this were Australians being told? So these evacuations are going on successively through Greece and Crete. I mean, really quite extraordinary numbers evacuated, notwithstanding the exhaustion by the time they get to Crete. But what were Australians being told, if anything, about all this?
The Australian ratings on the ships weren't actually being told a lot. There was a lot of rumours going around. So it was one of the things that I kept finding when I was reading through their personal diaries was there's this buzz going around that we might have to get troops off Greece or we might have to get troops off Crete, but no one really knew what was going on. So it would have only been those higher up, so those like Heckwaller, who would have been told more explicitly, okay, we're going to Greece, we need to evacuate troops. So there was an awareness among, the ratings and lower officers that the situation had gone badly in Greece or gone badly in Crete, and therefore they might need to be evacuated, and since we're in the Mediterranean, we might be the ones evacuating. But no sort of clear command, okay, this is what you're doing. They just went with the ship.
And the reporting back to Australia, to Australians,
Yeah.
like if you're back here and you've got a son or a husband or father serving in one of these ships, they're in the Mediterranean. What were Australians being told? How was it characterised in the Australian media?
I haven't actually looked into the media much yet because I haven't had time. I was focused very much on the operation itself. But I know that obviously from the second Anzac Day idea that was coming through later on after the war. I'm not 100% sure how they were reporting it during the war. That's certainly something that when I'm writing my paper I'll be looking into to give it some context. But in terms, since I had the 6 weeks, I really just wanted to get an understanding of what the operation was and how it was happening.
Carl will give me a 30-minute remedial lecture this afternoon.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you very much, Hannah. That was fantastic. I'd like to call up Dr. David Sutton to introduce his scholar, Daniel Seaton.
Good morning, my name's David Sutton and I'm a historian in the military history section here at the War Memorial. I've been supervising Daniel Seaton's Summer Scholar Project. He joins us from King's College in London, where he just completed a Master's on the Charles Bean's writing on Villers-Bretonneux in the First World War, and he's about to start a PhD at the University of Sydney, where he's looking at Australian war correspondence from 1914 right through to 1945. It's been an absolute pleasure supervising Daniel's paper on a rather understudied aspect of Australia's military history, and he's shown his ability to look at a wide variety of sources and string them together and show an expert knowledge on a topic about which he might not have known much about 6 weeks ago very well. So it's my pleasure to introduce him and his talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. And also thanks very much to everybody at the Australian War Memorial for making me feel so welcome over the past 6 weeks. So to turn to my talk, Fighting Against the French, Australians in the Allied Invasion of Lebanon and Syria, 1941. When we think of notable actions that Australians were involved in the Second World War, we understandably think of engagements which have over the decades been etched into national consciousness. Tobruk, Kokoda and Milne Bay, for example. The chances are that the Lebanon and Syria campaign of June to July 1941, fought against pro-Axis Vichy French forces, would not immediately spring to mind. In the grand scheme of the Second World War, the campaign was a relatively minor event. Even in the context of Australia's war, it's understandable that heroic narratives such as Tobruk and Kokoda are more well known. For the men who fought there, however, and the grieving families of those who were lost, the campaign was anything but a confusing sideshow. According to the Australian official historian of the Second World War, Gavin Long, 416 Australians, largely of the recently formed 7th Division, were killed in the campaign, amongst a total casualty count of over 1,500. 2 Victoria Crosses, received in Lebanon, awarded to Lieutenant Roden Cutler and Private Jim Gordon, were amongst the first 4 VCs received by Australians in the entire war. So why is it that the campaign has been cloaked in relative obscurity? And how did Australians really experience it? 2 things which might help to explain this are, firstly, the trials and tribulations of the 7th Division's commanders, particularly those of Major General and later Lieutenant General John Laverack, and secondly, the experiences and attitudes of the ordinary Australian troops on the ground, who made up more than half of the invasion force's total numbers. These men were at the centre of a short but tough campaign, fought in difficult, steep and rocky terrain, through barren valleys and across swollen rivers. It was fought against an unexpectedly determined and well-prepared former ally-turned-enemy, an unusual foe, not a clear-cut enemy like the Germans, Italians or Japanese, but a far more ambiguous opponent in the form of the Vichy French. In short, this was a complex and hard-fought introduction to combat for the men of the 7th Division. In his 1989 memoir, Corporal Anthony McKinnon, a veteran of the campaign, wrote that very little credit, if any, has been given to the commanding officers and troops who secured this vital northern flank of Lebanon and Syria. In Australia, we hardly get a mention. This was a sentiment shared by many participants in the campaign. Since McKinnon wrote his memoir, work on the campaign has improved, but it's varying in quality and remains a far less well-known and understood aspect of Australia's Second World War experience, despite being a notable success, coming swift on the coattails of disasters in Greece and Crete. So what actually occurred in the campaign, and where does it fit into the wider context of the Second World War? Well, the months prior to the Lebanon and Syria campaign saw the Middle East command of British General Archibald Wavell stretched to the limit. The campaign in North Africa against Rommel's Afrika Korps and Italian forces continued to rage on. The Greek campaign had resulted in crushing failure, and new threats had begun to emerge. Chief among these was the concern that the pro-Axis Vichy French-held colony of Lebanon and Syria could serve as a base from which the Axis could launch further attacks on the Allies and threaten their oil supply through Iran and Iraq, as well as through Haifa in Palestine. The fear that this unstable region surrounding Lebanon and Syria could be engulfed by pro-Axis sympathies, should Germany gain an increased presence there, was a major concern. and the possible political and diplomatic repercussions in Egypt and Turkey were also significant considerations. As such, planning for the campaign had begun in mid-May at the instigation of the Free French leader Charles de Gaulle and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill recognised Lebanon and Syria's geopolitical strategic significance, writing to Wavell on the 9th of May that our information leads us to believe that Admiral Darlan of the Vichy French has probably made some bargain to help the Germans get in there, whilst de Gaulle was keen to wrest control of the area from his German-backed Vichy adversaries, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain. Wavell's already extensive list of objectives was thus extended, and he soon appointed British General Henry Maitland-Wilson as General Officer Commanding of the British forces for the invasion. The bulk of the force was to be made up of the recently formed 7th Australian Division, commanded at that time by Major General John Laverack, supported by British, Free French and Indian troops primarily. So the plan of attack was as follows. The advance north across the Palestine border would be split into 3 columns. On the coast, the 7th Division's 21st Brigade would advance across the Litani River and continue on to the important city and port at Beirut. Further inland, the 25th Brigade would advance across mountainous terrain, capturing strategically important forts at Merj Ayoun and Khayyam, before pushing on to the important rail hub at Rayak. On the Australian right, the 5th Indian Brigade would capture Deraa and Quneitra, with a 6 battalion strong Free French force continuing on past the Indian Brigades to Damascus, thus forming the Beirut-Rayak-Damascus line. And it's worth noting here that the Allied invasion occurred not just in Syria, but what was referred to at the time as the French Mandate for Syria and Lebanon. The vast majority of the Australian involvement actually occurred in Lebanon, despite the campaign often being referred to as simply the Syrian campaign, an error which is likely fostered by Gavin Long's title for the official history. Though the fighting was much tougher than expected, with the Vichy French capitalising on the absence of Allied tanks, the campaign initially proceeded well after commencing on the 8th of June. The coastal column had been slowed by the destruction of the bridge over the Litani by the Vichy French, but they successfully fought their way across the river, establishing a new bridge and pushing on towards Beirut. In the centre, progress stalled around Merj Ayoun after Laverack changed the focus of the attack to the coast via the town of Jazin, believing it to have the highest chance of quick success. Following a well-prepared counterattack by the Vichy French in mid-June, which resulted in their recapture of Merj Ayoun, the fighting entered a tense period. When Merj Ayoun was eventually retaken by Australian forces on the 24th of June, the capture of Damour followed, the river at which was the last natural obstacle before Beirut. Faced with this and continuing attacks by the British and Free French in the Damascus sector, the Vichy French commander General Dance signed an armistice on the 13th of July, thus bringing the campaign to an end. Throughout the campaign, relations between the British and Australian high commands were strained. Laverack, who assumed command of the 1st Australian Corps on the 18th of June and overall command of the majority of the campaign, increasingly clashed with Wavell and Maitland-Wilson. One particular source of contention was Laverack's assertion that his British superiors had failed to understand the nature of the terrain and severely underestimated the enemy. Laverack wrote to Gavin Long in the 1950s, "I was and am convinced that Wavell and Wilson hoped that the Vichy French would not put up even token resistance. Wavell once expressed to me the hope that we should be in Beirut in 1 day, or 2 at the most. In reality, this took 5 weeks." This lack of understanding was compounded by Maitland-Wilson's decision to base himself in the luxurious King David Hotel in Jerusalem, nearly 200 kilometres away from the main fighting, from which he attempted to run the entire campaign prior to Laverack's promotion on the 18th of June. Wavell, meanwhile, was primarily concerned with operations in North Africa. The unsuccessful Operation Battle Axe, launched to wrest control of Cyrenaica from the Axis and rage the siege of Tobruk, had been launched 1 week after the beginning of the Lebanon and Syria campaign, and Wavell concentrated his efforts there. He had very reluctantly been dragged into Syria and Lebanon by Churchill, and at first believed an invasion to be a serious mistake, writing on the 21st of May that, "You must trust my judgment in this matter or relieve me of command. I am not willing to accept that de Gaulle should dictate action that is bound seriously to affect the military situation in the Middle East." And indeed, as much as Laverack criticised Wavell, it must be remembered that Wavell was stretched to the limit and was justified in his prioritising of operations in North Africa, given its greater strategic importance to the Allies. As such, after Churchill had forced him to launch the campaign, Wavell decided to concentrate the tanks available to him in North Africa, much to Laverack's frustration. I believed he had not the least comprehension of the differences between the Lebanon and the African desert, Laverack wrote after the war. He knew nothing of the rough rocky slopes over which our turning movements had to struggle. Laverack's complaints were understandable. His 7th Division, minus 1 brigade who were at Tobruk, were faced by a determined Vichy French force consisting of around 2.5 divisions. This force was certainly underestimated. It was hoped by the British and Free French leaders, for example, that French-speaking officers attached to each battalion would be able to persuade the Vichy forces to swiftly surrender by approaching them with white flags and speaking to them through megaphones. This, of course, failed resoundingly when faced with a well-fortified and motivated enemy who used the difficult terrain to their advantage, and came in for severe criticism from Laverack and his deputies. Arthur Allen, who succeeded Laverack as commander of the 7th Division upon the latter's promotion, wrote to Gavin Long that the campaign wasn't a walkover. It hasn't got the publicity because the heads will not admit that they underestimated the fighting spirit of the French. The country was ideal for defence. Each one of those battles was equivalent to our big New Guinea battle. So it's clear, therefore, that the Australian commanders in Lebanon and Syria understood the severity and difficulty of the campaign in a way in which their British superiors failed to comprehend until well into and after the fighting. Wavell confessed to Laverack at the end of the campaign, for example, that a company or battalion of tanks would have been better invested in Lebanon and Syria than they were in North Africa. The frustration of his interaction with Wavell irreparably damaged Laverack's relationship with him. I cannot forgive him, Laverack wrote in 1952, despite my knowledge of his troubles. He seemed to believe that I was making difficulties, whereas the fault was in himself and his advisers, who believed that the French would not resist. He never realised how difficult was the task he had given us to perform in 1 or 2 days. Even Laverack's great rival, General Blamey, rang Maitland-Wilson at the King David Hotel during the campaign to support Laverack's plan of attack, going so far as to drive to Jerusalem to convince Maitland-Wilson. So what does this conflict within the highest levels of Australian and British high commands tell us about the campaign? Tensions between Australian and British commanders are of course not unique to this campaign or even this war, but the lack of cohesion in part helps to explain both the confused command structure of the campaign and the complexities of the invasion's execution. Laverack and his deputies, being actually present in Lebanon and Syria, understood the difficulties they were faced with. Yet when this was communicated to Wavell, it was often met with an unwillingness to act due to his understandable prioritising of events in North Africa. This contributed to the deputation of the campaign in the wider context of the war, and therefore, to some extent, the suppression of the Australians' achievements in Lebanon and Syria. This was not helped by the opening of Operation Barbarossa in the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, which was arguably the most important development of the war to date, and took the majority of the contemporary press coverage. It is also important to note just how complicated command of the campaign actually was. The command structure shifted multiple times during the fighting. Wavell was replaced in his capacity as Middle East Commander-in-Chief by Claude Auchinleck towards the end of the campaign, whilst Laverack essentially took control of the Allied forces in Lebanon and Syria from Maitland-Wilson upon his promotion to commander of the 1st Australian Corps on the 18th of June, being replaced as 7th Division commander by Arthur Allen. Brigade and battalion commanders, meanwhile, changed multiple times as Laverack split up his forces, and occasionally when he felt that his own deputies were not up to the job, as happened with Brigadier Alfred Baxter Cox, who was the original commander of the 25th Brigade. Of the 5 commanders pictured here at the end of the fighting, 4 had changed positions during the campaign. And this picture is also a good example of the terrain that was fought across, with Hill 1284 being in the background, which Australians charged up under heavy machine gun and mortar fire in late June. So if it was such a confusing picture at the top, then what was it like for the ordinary troops on the ground, many of whom were experiencing their first action? The campaign was a complicated introduction to combat for many of the men of the 7th Division, and it's evident that a significant number of them had little understanding of why they actually found themselves in Lebanon and Syria. Sergeant Peter Gibson of the 2nd 5th Field Regiment, for example, stated after the war that we had been told nothing, didn't even know why we were going. There was no information at all. We didn't know the strategy and didn't really know why we ever went there until a long time afterwards. Similarly, Captain George Connor of the 2nd 33rd Battalion, when asked how much he actually knew about the campaign in the Vichy French, replied nothing, not a thing. The ambiguity of the enemy, who many at first were not sure would even offer resistance, and who employed the use of colonial Foreign Legion troops from places like Senegal and Tunisia, only added to the complexity of the situation. To be plunged into the middle of terrain which they knew nothing about, facing an enemy they knew nothing about, and short of crucial support like tanks, must have been a difficult introduction to combat, to say the least. The maps supplied to them were vague, on a 1 to 200,000 scale, and proved insufficient for the uses of the infantry. The underestimating of the Vichy French had also led to the order for the Australian troops to march into action on the first day of the campaign, still wearing their slouch hats rather than helmets, in the mistaken belief that the French would recognise them as Australians and thus excellent soldiers, resulting in their immediate surrender. Met with ferocious enemy fire, the decision to replace the slouch hats was made within the first hour. As the reality of the fighting began to set in, attitudes towards the Vichy French generally began to harden. The historian of the 2nd 33rd Battalion, William Crooks, noted that the Australian troops strongly disliked the Vichy French due to their collaboration with the Germans. The theme of the Vichy French as collaborators features prominently in Australian descriptions of them. To return to Corporal McAnanty's memoir, he is keen to stress to the reader that, in his words, all Frenchmen were not freedom fighters and heroes of the resistance. A very considerable number were willing collaborators, and in Syria fought a bloody campaign against the British and Australians. He continued, Vichy French regulars fought with a ferocity that was sadly lacking in the defence of their own homeland. The fact that the Vichy French were ex-allies no doubt wrangled with the Australian troops, who regularly described their enemy as traitors. As Lieutenant Lindsay Mason of the 2nd 14th Battalion remarked, someone who is your ally and then switches over and starts fighting against you, you don't like them very much. Even the Free French, who fought alongside the Australians, came in for criticism, with one veteran claiming that the Free French treated us as though we never existed. What a thankless job for a thankless people. So after all this, we can make several conclusions about the Lebanon and Syria campaign of June to July 1941. Having been faced with a well-prepared, numerically superior and motivated enemy, and having triumphed despite the initial mismanagement of the campaign, it's understandable that participants felt that it had been completely overlooked, both at the time and subsequently. Alan Trelaw of the 2nd 14th Battalion recollected that the Syrian campaign was the first campaign our side won during the war, but it got little publicity because Churchill preferred to think of the French as our natural allies. It's an absurdity that those of us who served in Syria and won the first campaign wear the Africa star. Our real battle was in Syria, and there should have been a Syrian star. Though Trelaw's claim that the campaign was the first major Australian triumph of the war is highly questionable, to say the least, his comments relating to Churchill and the award of medals is pertinent. Churchill wanted the French to be viewed as allies. Believing that the fight against the Vichy French would confuse this, Churchill never made any great effort to publicise events in Lebanon and Syria, much to the disappointment of Laverack, his deputies, and the men who fought there. Were a Syrian star to exist, perhaps, the men would not have felt so hard done by. The campaign was highly complex at both the top and the bottom levels. The tension at the top of the command structure, which changed significantly during the course of the campaign, along with a convoluted chain of events on the battlefield, meant that it was a confusing picture for those at the top level of proceedings, let alone for those at the other end. At the same time, the achievements in Lebanon and Syria were understandably overshadowed by events such as those at Tobruk and elsewhere in North Africa, which held primary strategic importance for the Allies, as well as the British reluctance to pay full heed to these achievements. Even after the armistice had been signed, Laverack, who had effectively ran the majority of the campaign, complained about how he was treated in the official celebratory functions in Beirut. "No Australians need apply," he wrote in his diary, "whatever the Corps has done. I was completely ignored. They treated us as a dependent nation, or perhaps as mercenaries." These frustrations filtered through to the ordinary Australian troops, who had borne the brunt of the unexpectedly fierce fighting. Many of them did not fully understand why they were there, or the nature of their ambiguous enemy. For such a complex enemy, who had been misunderstood even by those at the highest levels of command, the men came to form generally simplistic views of the Vichy French. They saw them as a turncoat power that collaborated with the Germans, a power that fought fiercely in Lebanon and Syria, and yet had been convincingly rolled over in their homeland. Ultimately, complications and tensions in command, coupled with a complex situation on the ground, may have contributed to the campaign's obscuration. Though there were numerous heroic Australian accounts during the campaign, they became to some extent subsumed by the confusion of events in Lebanon and Syria, and by the wider context of the war. Though it was considered a significant campaign by the British, it remains an irritating sideshow to the areas of primary focus, particularly North Africa, where Australians could find a simpler and more clear-cut demonstration of heroism in the form of Tobruk. With the opening of Operation Barbarossa II on the 22nd of June, the war exploded into a new crucial theatre, and attention was understandably pulled even further away from Lebanon and Syria. Plagued by command difficulties in the face of an unusual former ally turned enemy, the campaign did not receive the recognition many participants felt that it deserved, and it largely remains a relatively obscure 5-week period of the Second World War to this day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. What a fantastic overview of a complex campaign. Do we have questions for Daniel?
Thanks, Daniel, for a great talk and what I'm sure will be a great paper. You spoke a couple of times about the terrain, and from what I can see in the photographs, it appears that they could easily be interchangeable with scenes from regional Australia. Was there any kind of familiarity with the terrain written in personal notes by soldiers?
There are, if you read the diaries, there are occasionally likenings of the terrain to country in Australia. But what is interesting actually is often troops talk of the alienation of the environment. Many of them, when they heard that they were going to Lebanon and Syria, expected just large expanses of desert, sandy environment, and they record in their diaries how different it was to what they expected. The steep mountains and these rocky rivers that they had to traverse was certainly not something that they expected. So there was actually a large degree of shock when the Australians found what they encountered. So yes, you would think there would actually be more comparisons to the environment back in Australia. But the overwhelming theme that comes across in the diaries and the letters is how alien this environment was for the men. So, yeah, it's a good question.
Thanks, Daniel. It's fascinating, isn't it, how such an important campaign slipped from national memory? And that's what I want to ask you about. The role of the men themselves in nurturing that memory after the war, battalion associations and so on, commemorative agencies, marking the day of the battle, that kind of thing. Or did the men prefer to remember latter campaigns, internalising that view of the campaign as a kind of sideshow?
That's a really good question. Yeah, because obviously the 7th Division goes off to New Guinea, fights at Kokoda. So many of the men actually talk about their experiences in Lebanon and Syria being almost a blooding of the division. It was their first experience of combat, and they took certain lessons that they learnt in Lebanon and Syria over to New Guinea with them. But then after the war, if you go onto the Australians at War film archive and you listen to the interviews with the veterans, almost without exception, they are angry that the campaign has been overshadowed. One veteran was talking about on the 50th anniversary of the campaign, the campaign was entirely left out of the commemoration of the events of 1941. Obviously, Tobruk was the big focus. So often in these subsequent accounts, men are entirely frustrated at not being remembered in this way. And it comes across in one of the quotes that I had here from Alan Trelaw, who was saying that there should have been a medal for the Syrian campaign because they viewed themselves as being entirely separate from the other actions that were going on in North Africa, and rightly so. So I think that the men want everything to be remembered, but of course it's hard to remember everything, especially when Syria lacked and Lebanon lacked the strategic importance of other areas. And I think men did acknowledge that subsequently. but they still wanted their efforts to be remembered there. 416 Australians were killed. So it's not an insignificant area of engagement in the Second World War at all.
Thank you. Number 3 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, was one of the supporting arms. How quickly did they get involved in the Syrian campaign?
Well, fairly soon, actually. And Laverack does talk in his diaries about how important the Air Force was, as well as the Navy. Of course, the usual complaint that Laverack has is there wasn't enough. So I think there are, in total, 70 aircraft active in the skies above Lebanon and Syria during the campaign, performing duties that you would expect them to, so bombing runs and fighting against Vichy French fighters that were there. But they arrived pretty soon on, almost from the start of the campaign, and remained so. And more aircraft did arrive, but not as many as Laverack would have hoped for.
Thank you.
Great paper. What was the makeup of the French troops for the Vichy troops? Were they regulars or were they perhaps legionnaires? And did that have any impact on their ferocious resistance?
Well, the Vichy French, there were 35,000 of them in Lebanon and Syria, of which 8,000 were regulars. The vast majority of the force was from the Foreign Legion, so Senegal, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, areas like that, as well as 10,000 troops from the Levant, which Gavin Long describes as being ineffectual, but there you go. Yes, so, 8,000 regulars. But the overwhelming makeup of the Vichy force was these troops from the Foreign Legion. And what's interesting in the Australian accounts of the campaign is there is a distinction made between the Foreign Legion troops and the regulars. And occasionally that has undertones of racism there. Not in vast numbers, but there is a distinction made. And there are occasionally often quite cartoonish depictions of Foreign Legion troops in Lebanon and Syria. And also it's interesting, at the end of the campaign, Vichy French troops were offered the chance to join Charles de Gaulle's Free French forces, and hardly any took up the offer because they were loyal to Pétain, and Pétain had no great love for the British or the Allies. So many just did not take up that opportunity and returned to France, repatriated to France. This is roughly, the numbers of the Vichy's in Lebanon and Syria are roughly equal to the Allies. But there's contention also over number of casualties as well. So the official Vichy figures are 6,300 casualties, which includes 520 killed. The British said it was more like 9,000. And there's even contradictions in the Vichy numbers. So General Dance, who was in charge of the Vichy French forces, said that 1,100 Vichy French were killed, so almost double the number of the official figures. So this all feeds into this idea of the campaign being ambiguous and quite hard to understand, really, which is partly why the campaign is often overlooked, I think.
Couple of questions. You characterise the tensions between Wavell and Laverack as sort of the British versus the Australian sort of commander. I guess I'm wondering whether, in fact, it was might be characterised really as the tension between the officer back, be it the King David Hotel or somewhere else, versus a commander up closer to the front dealing with the immediate issues. In other words, if a British commander had that role, whether those tensions perhaps might have existed in a similar way, resourcing and those kind of things. And my other question is, particularly given we're not far from the centenary of the armistice in 1918, how the French remember this, if you have any insights into that. It may be outside the scope of what you looked at, but given that, we get all this nostalgic view of, French being very supportive of Australian soldiers in World War One, given Australian soldiers were killing either French from mainland France or at least foreign legionnaires.
Yeah, on the second question, that's a really good question. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure of the answer to that. I'll have to look into that more. For the first question, Laverack was a prickly personality. I was often known as being extremely difficult to get on with. So it may have been the fact that he just rubbed people up the wrong way. Maybe not so much to do with nationality dimension going on there. But what is interesting so the main sources for the Australian officers' recollections of the campaign are found in the Gavin Long papers here at the memorial. And almost without exception, they talk about the British commanders essentially not having any regard for the efforts of the Australians and for just simply overlooking the capabilities of Australians. So Maitland Wilson, trying to micromanage the campaign from 200 kilometres away, was probably partly because he just had no real interest in what the Australians were up to, had no real confidence, and it took a lot of persuasion, largely from Blamey, to get Maitland Wilson to actually hand over control of the campaign to the Australians, simply because he had no real confidence in Laverack. Maitland Wilson himself was a difficult figure to get along with. So, yeah, it's interesting personality clashes going on. I think in Lebanon and Syria in particular, such strong personalities clashing, and it happens within the Australian ranks as well. So Laverack writes in his diary about a brigadier called Alfred Baxter Cox, who was originally in charge of the 25th Brigade. And his criticisms are almost merciless, so he calls him a baby and things like that, despite the fact that Baxter Cox was seriously unwell and had to be evacuated back to Australia. So Laverack, by all means, is not universally loved in the Australian ranks either. So yeah, good question. And the Vichy French question, the French memory of it, I'll look into that because that's very interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Okay. Very good. Thank you for that, Daniel. And thank you to all three scholars. And thank you to all three scholars. I'd like to ask all three of you to come up, and I'd like to invite the director, Dr. Brendan Nelson, to come up and to present you with your certificates. Maybe up on the stage or in the front here.
Daniel seemed to document that criticism of the British generals with a little bit too much enthusiasm, so you might need help getting back home.
Excellent. Thank you very much, all three of you. And thank you all for coming and supporting our summer scholars. Can I ask you to thank them one final time?
I just say, Tom, thank you to you and those who've mentored and supervised our scholars. I said to the three scholars at a reception that the Speaker held for them last night at Parliament House that normal people would be rather perplexed by the idea of spending your summer in the History Department at the Australian War Memorial, but here are three young people that have immense passion for and intellectual enthusiasm for history, and this history in particular. And what each of you has done in your work, I know it's enriched you, but it's also enriched us. And I know Carl and David and Tom who've supervised you in the process. And as certainly a non-historian, I've got to say, Alex, in your work about the autographs, it made me realise even more so the importance of what we're doing with our Afghanistan veterans, asking them to autograph that wall that we've got down there. I think it's fair to say that particularly every person who wears the uniform in some way wants to be remembered and to leave a mark. And coming out of, obviously also, Daniel, your work about what those men did in Syria and Lebanon, I've sensed that in the past for these men of the 7th Division, and you've brought it to life. And it also reinforces the importance of the stories being told, which is what we all do here, and why these stories, especially of the last 30 years, need to be told. And as you know, that's why we need more space. They just need to know that what they did counts. And thank you for making sure it is counted. Congratulations.